So for those folks who don't know who the heck we are or like what kind of content we're making usually, so Ben and I are consultants in the software space. We've worked a ton with teams and on org design and logistics and project management and things like that at companies. And like we were just pontificating earlier today about where we're at. Like, so it's, July 2021 right now. And so we've all relatively settled into the new world order of like what work looks like. And, obviously some of the comments I'm going to make are software focused because, those are among the group of folks that have the luxury of even having this debate, which is funny. That's something we never talk about either, right? Is we're like, oh, working from home is the future. Like we don't ever need to see each other again. See, like as you can see, I've already got like a cheeky and cynical view on this whole thing. But like, it's like if you're a truck driver, guess what? You're getting back in the truck. And you were probably in the truck the whole time that this was happening, right? And it was probably very uncomfortable and scary, not even knowing if you had a job or if you were going to get to go back to your job or who you were being exposed to or when and where. And it's like, like, again, I think one of the ironies of this conversation is I really don't want to stretch out the word privilege, but we are in a privileged position to be able to debate whether or not
remote or not
it's right for us to go back to work or not. And you mentioned this thing earlier, just to kind of get right into it. You were like, there's almost this like the sort of like mainstream viewpoint right now is that remote work is good. Like it is desirable for us to work remotely as much as we can. Two, there's something sort of distinctly old-fashioned about meeting in person in an office. Remember when we used to do that? Like we also used to roll around in with horses and buggies. It's like there's that kind of vibe where it's like, what a defunct method to work together. Like clearly the cost benefit equation is so like unfavorable to work together in an office. Like think of how difficult that is. And then there's a third, which is like sort of the vague implication that like it's almost like oppressive by nature to ask people to come into the office. Like that's what the capitalists want you to do. Like if
they need to watch you at your desk.
Yeah,
they don't feel good about themselves.
Yeah, it's like it's the office space manager's like method to like sort of keep you in check.
Yeah.
Like remember in the old days when you didn't have these freedoms that you enjoy today. And like, and again, I've heard a lot of people sort of like tacitly acknowledge that it's like, oh man, it's been hard to be alone this whole year, and I really miss people and stuff. But like, but don't no, but I don't. I know. I should, very least I should get 4 days a week where I can work from home, or I should be able to move back home to Houston with my family, and keep my job in LA. Like that. That's a thing that should happen. I deserve that. There's an entitlement there. I think, and I think this is going to piss a lot of people off. Honestly, I can just hear these words coming out of my mouth, and I'm like, so many people are going to hate what I'm saying right now. But there's this elephant in the room, which is like, I feel like it's a very one-sided conversation right now.
Yeah.
And there's no article like the merits of going back into the office. Aren't you excited? Like I haven't seen that headline yet.
Right. And I think that's where if you like pull it down and you just go like, wait a minute, okay, let's take a value first approach.
Yeah.
Right. Like kind of bring it down. Okay, what's important to us? What are we trying to achieve? Right. What did we gain in remote work? What did we lose? And the thing I've said for a while now, for a long time, probably a year, when everybody goes remote, it will seem like everybody's more productive. Oh, we're more efficient. We get so much more done. Look, like I heard all kinds of stories. My velocity's improved, blah, 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 all this different stuff. And I remember you and I talking about it even back then and kind of going like, that's cool. I'm very cautious about that because what I believed would happen and what I think in some cases has happened is you're basically running on residual alignment.
Yeah.
right? Like you're running on the fact that you all kind of knew what you were trying to do and knew where you were trying to go. And that was because there were a lot of meetings that were in person, partially, but also because there was a lot of like osmotic communication around offices
Yeah.
and a very easy way for people to get in touch with each other and all these different things. And um, as that declined over time, as the aligned state that you were in, or the clear goals, or like the organized backlog, or whatever it was, like slowly degraded, if you didn't dramatically, what would have been a complete overcompensation in an in-person environment, in a remote one is no longer. If you didn't maintain that brutally and viciously, then you had teams then that were like, well, we're still more productive at getting stuff done, but we're not quite as good at getting value out.
You know,
And
it's interesting too. I think that doing that, if that was seen as, if that was understood and seen as necessary and desirable, I think doing that would have required a bunch of new tools that I think it's pretty clear people don't have.
no,
Like, we talk to companies that have always been remote. They've always been remote, even since before this started. And they're still very, I would say the tools that they are using to solve these alignment issues are still very much in their infancy. Like,
yeah,
they're not very mature tools. Like,
well,
regardless of what you think about the effectiveness of like having a bunch of meetings and stuff, I would say that the hit rate is still a lot higher on that than it is for like these remote companies figuring out like how do you keep a homogenous culture? How do you stay on the same page with this? So it's funny. I think very much to your point. I think that illustrates that those things are mostly intangibles. They're things that people aren't even thinking about.
and well, you see it, and there's different narratives you can play out across it. Like, one, note that those companies that were all the way remote before any of this happened, it wasn't like they often appreciated it. They liked it. They did like being remote. It gave them some flexibility, and remote always has its advantages. Has always had its advantages. Like, a lot of people in a lot of companies, even non-remote companies, had remote people on teams and whatnot in the tech sector. But these full remote teams, they were also the first ones that, yes, we like being remote. It's hard. It's really hard.
Yeah, that's true. They appreciate the cost.
They knew it already, and they
Yeah.
didn't go into it like, oh man, this is nothing but like flowers and sunshine and rainbows. Like, this is hard. It's much harder to keep people aligned because, it comes back to that argument for me that people make sometimes when they like destroy stand up, or they're like, no, we just do a quick stand up on Slack, which I'm not going to go into all of why that's problematic. But it's this idea that, like, don't worry, we have Slack. We'll communicate enough to stay in touch. And the reality is that every time I've seen that, I'm like, no, you don't. And it's not because you're wrong. It's not because you're not trying to. It's because there's something about being in person with other people and talking through the work and sitting nearby the people you're working with that allows, again, that osmotic communication, the sort of natural flow.
By the way, don't you love that? How like when we're all in the office together, uh, I would say if I could compile all of the comments I've ever heard about Slack or like similar company messaging digital messaging medium, that like I'd say 80% of those comments are cheeky or cynical in nature.
Yeah.
And 20% of them are like, this was pretty great. This helps us a lot.
Yeah.
Like most of those tools are just a great source of cynicism in our office culture.
Yes.
Yet all of a sudden now they're the thing we're going to bank our entire alignment strategy on. Now all of a sudden they're great. Well, we've got Slack, right? I'm like, you mean that thing that sucked that you said was not a good source of information of any kind, that you said the signal to noise ratio was like 9-1. Like, now that's the thing you're going to lean on.
Well, and when you have that as that primary tool, like we talk about it when we're doing training. If you can, please leave your mic on. We want you hot micing. I accept that sometimes your dog is going to bark. Why? Because if you have something to say, I want you to just be able to say it. I want you to be able to ask it.
Yeah.
I don't want you to have to go through the work of like hitting, unmute. Any barrier hinders our ability to effectively collaborate.
By the way, I love how you just use the term hot miking, and I'm like, oh man, I love that term. That's such a great term to describe what we need people. And then I'm like, wait a second, why do I need a special term for like what seemed to be a basic expectation before the pandemic?
You
It's
know
like,
what?
yes, when you're in a room full of other people having an engaging shared dialogue, it would make sense for you to keep your mic open, but that is not a foregone conclusion by any stretch of the imagination.
No.
Now, like we found, like when we're doing trainings with people, we have to like be very explicit that that is our hope and expectation for people, is to keep your mics and cameras on. Like, and again, there's something creeping in here, man. There's something creeping in here, which is like, I'm in my pajamas. I didn't do my hair this morning. I haven't showered in 3 days. The cat's jumping around, my kids screaming in the background, which, totally understandable, by the way.
Yes.
Completely understandable. But like at the same time, it's like the whole expectation of what being at work or like being engaged meant has like completely done a 180 and shifted on its head, and no one's talking about it at all. Like, and when we are talking about it, it's purely seen as an evolution and as a good thing.
Well, and I think that lack, like you said, you mentioned the lack of the other side. I remember being at the companies I've worked at, I realizing just how important seating was. Like they've done studies on this. If someone's more than like X number of feet away from you, they might as well be in a different building. And it's that same thing of why we want people to have their mic on when they're in the class. If they can, if it's at all possible, please leave your mic on. Because, well, a bunch of reasons. It removes the barrier. It lets me know you're not having a conversation with somebody else. Because if your mic's on and I'm not hearing anything, then like presumably you're at least somewhat engaged, right? Your camera on, I can tell if you're looking at me, you're looking at your phone. Like there's all these things. It lets me know you're present, you're engaged. And we want to remove those barriers. And the studies around what that used to be done on like seating in an office were that, yeah, if you weren't within a couple of seats of somebody, it didn't matter if they were in like the same broad section. Like I'm not a huge fan of open office spaces. I am definitely a fan of co-located seating for teams because, man, you want to be able to turn to your left or your right and ask a question. And every time it's like, oh, shoot, I can't do that. I need to go message somebody because they're in a different building, or I need to walk and walk over down the hall. And you're like, well, that's easy. You should just do it. I get it. No, that's what I've told people. Stand up, go walk down the hall, talk to the person you talk to. Nowadays, it would be, hey, find them on Slack, set up a short call, like figure out how to talk to them. But it's so much easier to, one, not do that and just go like, well, maybe I'll just figure it out on my own. Or two, for them to avoid that interaction if they are not in the mood for it at that moment. And part of me goes like, oh, that's good, right? You want people to have focus time, but all this stuff has to be in balance. And the problem is no one's providing this other perspective of we're losing alignment over time. We're losing our value orientation, and we're losing the ways in which we understood how to collaborate and the things that kept us close as teams. We're losing those. If we don't replace them with anything, it will be a struggle. We can't do a go out for beers after work if we're located in 7 different cities across 3 continents. What do you do? And
well, I think we've often talked about how there's like not a lot of room for subtlety in when it comes to like behaviors, cultures, the human dynamic in our industry. It's a very mathematical space where everything is sort of innately seen to boil down to some equation. And I think, back to the open mic thing, it's also like trying to preserve just a nugget of that element that you get when you're in a room with 7 other human beings and you can see the looks on people's faces. You can hear them, breathing at a certain pace and like things you might not even consciously think about, but tell you something about what's going on in the room, where people's attentions are at. Like if everyone were on their phones in a meeting that I was in the office, I would take that as like a pretty large cue that something was off. Like, why does no one care about this? What are we missing? Is this the right goal? Like, these are the questions that I would ask. However, it's almost meaningless within the context of the remote environment because it's like it could be any number of things. And most of the possible answers have a lot to do with just it being more difficult to engage.
Yes.
You know,
And studies have been done like Zoom fatigue, right? Having your camera on is more stressful than having your camera off. So there's like, okay, well, let's turn our cameras off. And so that we don't like stress everybody out. And I get it. It makes sense if we're all going to be on Zoom all the time. And we realize that having your camera on makes us really self-conscious and we feel weird and it's not the same as being in person. Like, I get it. You know, when I do coaching calls, I want it to be in person or on the phone. I don't like video coaching calls because I feel very constrained based on my camera. And so like I understand the idea of Zoom fatigue. Note also though that there is a cost when you turn that camera off. Now I can't see someone's eyes. I can't see their responses. Like they say I don't know, some high percentage of communication is nonverbal, 70% or whatever it is. It's about 50%. And regardless of how they figured all that out, there's some amount of information that is you're not getting when your camera's off. That even though, yes, you might still pick up on tone and all those things, when you can't see the other person and see them jump when you say something that they thought was wrong and like feel that inside is like, wait, something's off, and be able to respond to it. And you have to wait for them, especially if they're muted, to like wait for you to stop talking, press unmute, start talking, and be like, hey, I have a concern about that. And you don't realize that that concern just like scared them. You're just like, oh, someone has a concern, no biggie. It's subtle. But that's like the reality we're dealing with when we go to these full remote, when we switch our cameras off, when we don't have and
we dismiss that subtlety, which is sort of ironic because if anything, it becomes more important to preserve what subtlety is there. You know what I mean? Because like so by nature of the medium, when we're remote using Zoom and stuff, almost all the subtlety is lost. It's like very lostful when it comes to the behavior and the intuition and the tone and the facial expressions and all that stuff. Yet made even worse by the fact that I think we flush that without really recognizing the value. Like I think it's a hidden cost. And I think that goes back to your original point, is that this cost is very hidden. And I worry a lot that it will come back to bite us. And like one of the things, I mean, even to go outside of the logistics of alignment and stuff like that, there's a part of me that's just like, are we all going to be miserable? Like, is that a thing that's going to happen? You know what I mean? Like, I have to admit, despite how territorial everyone seems to be about their ability to work from home, I have difficulty seeing that people are happier now working from home than they were when we were in the office. And I don't know. I mean, this is just my perception from doing a lot of coaching, talking to a lot of people through the pandemic, doing classes, this kind of thing. I don't perceive that people are like, man, things are so much better in my life now. Like, I just love this. Like, I can't even imagine going back to there's guardedness around it, but also I feel like a lot of sadness and depression and isolation as well.
That's that. And it's nuanced. There's hidden costs, like the recognition that there isn't in life, there are so rarely options without trade-offs. And we're not looking at the negative trade-offs, and we brand people who look at them as like, you're just a capitalist idiot, or like, oh, you're just a manager who wants to see everybody. It's like, no,
my favorite one is like, well, yeah, I get it, Ben. Like, I mean, honestly, if we all go work remote and just figure out what to do on our own, like, you're pretty useless, aren't you? You probably be out of a job. This is one I hear a lot too, is that managers are going to become extinct as a breed. Like, this one is now, again, I've actually heard some compelling arguments recently that AI and technology will actually edge out management before it'll edge out people with technical skill. I think that there's a reasonable perspective there. However, the idea that like managers are going to become extinct because of people not being in the office anymore and not needing that, like that's completely backwards. I'm like, you're emphasizing the need for managers have never been more required than they are in a remote environment.
Well, and not only is it managers have been required, good managers, because the thing you can't get away with as well in a remote environment, and this is an upside, is being a bad manager who just like constantly walked around with your clipboard making sure everybody was at their desk at the right time.
Yeah.
Like, not kind of recognizing that you're doing knowledge work and like just sort of being the person who's like, what did I do? I yelled at my team to go faster today in the pit or
Actually,
whatever.
that guy probably will be out of a job. So
Yeah.
so maybe that's what they're thinking of when they say, when they think they hear the word manager and they assume it's that.
Well, and that's the thing. Like I saw an article, news article about this, and they were talking about, why did big companies want to go back into the office? Because I talked, as mentioned, like you had this initial thing, you saw this boost in efficiency, right? People were like, oh, look, our velocity is going up if you use velocity or whatever. Our productivity is going up. Look at that, it's great. And I was like, wait 6 months, wait 12 months, wait till the residual alignment and relationships that are so nuanced, but also so present in an office environment, good and bad, watch that decline. When that declines, what's going to happen? And you started seeing the companies that were like, yeah, we're remote forever, and like we think this is great, and all this different stuff. Why did they think that? Well, because productivity was up, and they liked the productivity being up. And then they started realizing that productivity and making stuff doesn't equate necessarily to value. And alignment and relationships do have, whether they thought about it in these terms or not, it was like something seems to be going wrong. And as something seems to be going wrong, then they're like, actually, we don't want to be full remote. We'll do flex schedules and all those different things. And they're trying desperately to compromise. And they're not going back and like, wait a minute, what's missing? What's present? Like, what is it that you're actually losing? And you talked a lot about culture. And you said, like, it's possible we're all more miserable. I can also see a world where if everybody's fully remote, do we all become more mercenary? The cost of me switching jobs is effectively like the time it takes me to send back one laptop and receive another from a different company.
Yeah, and it's interesting that ties into the nature of the relationships as well. Like I'm hearing people. We've talked to a couple companies recently where we've just been like doing coaching and stuff, and I've had several folks mention to me off the cuff, like, "Oh yeah, like over half my team has been hired since this happened, and so I've actually never met over half the people on my team." And that's really interesting too, because back to your point, if those ties are what keep you, which I think I wouldn't be surprised. I feel like I've read something about this before, but I wouldn't be surprised if those ties are actually a big reason why people stay in their current jobs. If those ties are much weaker now, then yeah, that would also lead to a more mercenary environment.
Right. And they absolutely are weaker. Because, well, for a couple of reasons. Obviously, you're not sitting next to that person, going to lunch with that person, that sort of thing, right? But two, it's also because we're not choosing to replace, even in a hacked way, so much of that osmotic, subtle stuff that was part of being in an office. And I have seen some companies do this, and a lot of them were the ones that were already remote because, again, they're ahead of the curve. They've been learning about this for years, and how do we make it work? But it's, okay, so we can't go to lunch together as a team. Okay, that's all right. What we do is, let's say everybody can play video games on your team or something. We play video games together, or we play a board game online through some online interface. We play a board game with each other every Thursday for a couple hours, maybe on work hours from like 3 to 5. We spend that time, and you need more of that if you want your teams to be developing a relationship with each other. And you do, because the relationship is a precondition to the healthy collaboration you want. And the healthy collaboration you want is a precondition to the learning that you want. And the learning is a precondition to the value that you want to deliver. And that's where, for me, even coming back to like, what are the agile values, right? Like, walk that all the way back. And this is about customer focus. This is about collaboration. This is about learning together. It's about responding to change, which is similar to learning. Like, there's this thing though where,
but then we already knew what we needed to do, and now without our corporate overlords breathing down our neck all the time, we can just focus on the work and get it done.
See, and that, I think that the funny thing is, if that works, it's the same thing as the managers that are out of a job.
For sure. Yeah.
It's like, yes, and that implies you were already broken. And great, use this remote time as an opportunity to learn and hopefully get better, because you're broken. If you're in a world where you know, there's guys like me or gals like me who are sitting at the higher levels of your organization actually adding zero value, and this going remote has literally just freed your entire company. Like the the implication of that is not necessarily that like remote's amazing and managers are stupid. It's like, hey, you don't have very good managers, and that the upper levels of your organization are not as useful as you probably thought they were. Certainly, probably not as worth as much as you're spending on them.
Yeah.
And like that's a good realization. Like I think that's a positive thing.
Yeah, for sure.
So I don't know. Yeah, when I think about this, it's like, man,
I'm curious, like, I mean, I don't know if this is a rabbit hole, but like my mind is asking me why. Like what's actually going on? So we've sort of touched on it, but like what is this? It does feel like there's an obsession with remote work right now. And again, I'm gonna be very maybe it's not controversial. I feel like it's controversial. Like I feel like if I'm completely honest and authentic, like someone's gonna stab me in my sleep about this. But like I feel like there is like this like insane entitlement around this now, where it's like the the workplace needs to accommodate my personal situation and the physical space that I live in. And again, I when I look at it within terms of the pandemic, it actually makes a lot of sense
yes, right.
because it's like, hey, I had a 2-bedroom house, and one of them the cat pooped in, and my baby's crib was in, and the other one my wife and I shared. And so now I have to work in that office. And so there's a cat pooping in the background and a baby crying. Like that's like I wasn't gonna buy a new house. Well, I mean, a lot of people did, but I shouldn't have had to buy a new house just because that happened, right? So there's a that I can totally understand.
Yeah.
However, there's this like when the conversation comes up of like, hey, like I would like you to have your camera on while you're in a meeting, there's a reaction which is not, hey, look, like I can't do that now, and here's why, but I'd really like to. The reaction tends to be like, whoa, man. Hey, we don't do that anymore. Okay. Like this is the world order now.
You're
I'm
stomping
at
on
home
my
right now. Like my wife may need to ask me a favor anytime. Okay. Like I got to be ready for that. And I'm like, so there's this immediate like rejiggering of the hierarchy of priorities and who's got what time and where your focus is that just like shuffled overnight and has now become innate. So it's like, so now your company that pays your salary is expected to take a back seat to anything that may be going on in your environment. And again, some folks might argue to me that that's a temporary state of affairs and like, hey man, we're all just trying to get along in the pandemic as much as we can. And if I believed that were true, I think I'd be like, oh, obviously. But I don't feel like that's true. I feel like where everyone's like placing their bets right now is like, this is it. This is what we're doing from now on. Our company, they dumped our corporate office space.
right.
This is reality now. And like in a lot of these details and how this is supposed to work and what tools do we actually use to stay connected to each other, like no one's talking about any of that. Any of it. It's just like I work from home now. I'm comfortable here. Like I'm not dressed today. I'm just naked at my computer.
Right.
And honestly, I kind of deserve it. I kind of deserve to be naked at my computer if I want to.
When I think about it, because a quote I've used before is, I think it's the Richard Branson quote, take care of your people and your people will take care of your customers. And I really like that. And I think he was pushing against this idea that what a company's job was to somehow like exploit its employees as best they possibly could in the interests of getting money from customers. Right. And he's like, no, take really good care of your people. And so I think that's right. The reality though is that like in all things there is balance, and the pendulum, which you could say what had been for so long on the exploit your people as much as you can, like don't worry about burning them out, et cetera, as long as you can produce value, you can always hire more, and customers will keep paying you, so just crush them, who cares. That's bad. On the opposite side, I think, and this is where the pandemic almost forced the pendulum swing, is some version of like screw the company. I should be able to work however I want. And if they won't accommodate, I'll go find someone who will. And I don't have, and for me, it's actually, when you were talking, it was like, it's the lack of the meeting in the middle, the compromise of, hey, you're a company. You have things that you want me to know. You have stuff you want me to do, and you pay me for it. And I do work for you. And some of the things that you want aren't just that, like, I execute my expertise. If you're a good company, you also want me to care about the company's values. You also want me to care about the people I work with and have relationships with them. You want me to enjoy working with these people. And part of that isn't just like, it is the Richard Bronson thing of take care of your people and then they'll take care of the customer. And in the end, we all get taken care of because we are all the customer of each other's companies. Like, when we swing to this other extreme, the pendulum goes over to the, like, I am the most important part of all the work that I do. Like, I'm the most, and you must cater to my particular needs. It's like, okay, I get that you want that. Are you willing to flex it all? Are you, because the reality is, hey, maybe for some people they add so much value in such a short amount of time, and you and I know people like this, that, like, the company's willing to bend over backwards to meet whatever it is that they ask for. Mm-hmm. But if you're not that person, well, okay, cool. I guess you're going to leave and go find another company. And again, that encourages us towards a mercenary attitude.
Well, and also the fact that you don't have to carry the cost of that for everyone might make it much more palatable to do it for one or two people if it's a special case, right?
Yeah.
One of the things that just struck me, like a couple of the things you've said have brought up is I think a lot of the things we're talking about that are really important, that we're worried that people are not taking seriously or being slightly dismissive of, if I'm honest with myself, are already the things that we were not thinking about enough and quite dismissive of. So I think what's interesting about that is, depending on which side of the argument you're on, whether you're like, hey, human connection and relationships and, like, subtlety and culture and all this stuff and alignment and all this stuff are important, versus, this is a waste of time. We have too many meetings. My boss says all this, like, humdum, and he goes to trainings and then he comes back and he tries to, like, coach us, and it's really annoying. I wish I could just get some work done. Like, if you're on that side of the argument, you're probably thinking right now, like, see, I told you all that stuff was useless. See, we've gone a whole year without it now, and everything seems to be fine, So, like, I could totally see, it's fascinating, isn't it? I could see that there's vindication there. Yes. For you. If the ceiling's still up and you're still getting a paycheck and things generally seem to be okay, with a minor to moderate additional cost, you're probably thinking quite, vindicated in your view on that, which is like, all of that overhead, all that stuff is useless. Or mostly useless or whatever. And if you're on the side of the argument where you're like, hey, this stuff really matters, you're even more worried now than you were before. But I think what's interesting is, the way I feel that is that I'm concerned about a future state. Yes. I see us barreling towards that state, but that state won't truly implode until, as you say, the alignment entropy hits critical mass or whatever, to butcher a bunch of physics terms. You can tell I'm really a scientist. But like once that alignment degrades to the point where there's not enough left of it for us to really get any meaningful value without recentering, then one thing's gonna, like, and again, when we are confronted with that, if we are in a situation where we got rid of the corporate office space, if we are in a situation where we doubled the company's staff and all those new people are from, like, far-flung countries across the globe, we now no longer have an option to use any of the tools that we used before. We have to use tools that literally do not exist.
That we don't understand, we don't know about, we haven't built. And the funny thing is, when I think about it, some of that is actually, like, technological, like, the tools don't exist. But some of that is even, really, we haven't thought through what it would look like to facilitate a remote, like, long-term alignment session among a group of people about anything. Yeah. And that is, to me, like, I kind of want to like talk about, hey, if I was a company, I was running a company or CEO of a company, what would I be orienting to? Especially now that people are going, like they're thinking about doing flex time, or like, oh, you spend one day in a week in the office and the rest are out. Like, what do you do on that day? And it's funny because I think a lot of people are going to want to like, well, in that day we want to talk about all the work. And I'm like, sort of. Actually sometimes no. Because I think that's the trap. The reality is it's actually the work itself, the stuff we're doing is easily talked about on Zoom calls. The thing you want to do when you all go into the office is spend time together, because that you want to be building those relationships. You want to be understanding who the people are around
And I
you.
think also understanding your orientation as well.
Yeah.
Like what's important to us and which direction do we want to go? Because again, that's where you have a meeting about the work. It's defined. We have to do these 10 things. We're negotiating who's going to do which of the 10 things. Are we actually only going to be able to get 7 things done or 10? Like you said, reasonable to do that without being too concerned with all the flavor of human subtlety. But like if you're sitting in a room and talking about like what is important to us as a group,
Yes.
who do we want to be as a team? How do we want to show up for each other? And somebody's sitting with their arms crossed in the corner, not engaging, with like a scowl on their face that you might not even notice because their face didn't happen to pop up at the right moment on the Zoom call. Really big deal.
Yes.
Really, really big deal.
That's where, when I think about what do I want, like, okay, let's say you spend one day a week in the office, right? And the rest of the days you're out because we all went to flex, and your company would riot if you did anything else. So they'll give you one day, do a cornhole tournament. Not even kidding. Like do something where everybody gets together and they go to a park and they play a game together. Do your retrospectives, right? Something where we need to be talking. Hey, how's it going? How is work going among us? How's that been? Like, go out to lunch as a group. Talk about high level strategy and vision stuff. What matters to our company? Why does it matter? Have people together to talk about that. Like these are the sorts of things you should be doing on that day. And even letting that some amount of that day be the team. Let's say if you had your organization split into teams, sitting and doing work for like 4 hours of that day with no meetings. It's like, well, we can do that from home. No, you can't.
That's really interesting too, because that points to another subtlety. What are the working habits and preferences of the individuals on my team? Like you'll pick up on some of this through remote work, but like short of like what you and I tend to do, which is like a lot of times we'll work with our camera on the whole day. Assuming you're not doing that, and I get the impression a lot of teams are not doing that. And even if you are doing that, it's still very lossful. How do I understand what your working habits are and how to find congruency between mine and yours, much less the other 6 people on our team, right?
Yeah.
Like that's something you almost can't avoid.
In the office.
When the office, it's like if somebody goes to lunch 3 hours later, might be the most minor thing in the world. I'm not saying it's not. Somebody goes to lunch at 3:00 every day when the rest of the team's like really during their in focus time, that might warrant a conversation or might have some kind of an impact. You may never even know that in a work environment because it's so touch and go all the time.
Well, it's this thing of should work and relating to each other at work always be asynchronous? And the answer I would give to that question is no. And it's a biased question. But you could just say, what's the balance between synchronous work and asynchronous work inside of your environment? Because to really, I mean, you and I have seen this, right? We've led teams, we've delivered some cool stuff, we've delivered some not cool stuff. But in it, like one of those great moments that I don't think about as much, when I didn't think about as much because I sort of took it for granted based on the environment and the culture and whatnot, was when somebody on a team stands up or slides their chair or whatever over to somebody else's desk and they start working on something together. And it happens very naturally. And it was maybe because maybe one of them was struggling with something that the other one knew a lot about. Or maybe it was just because like, hey, let's tag team this together. You can still do that stuff remotely. The barrier to entry is so much higher because we default to asynchronous communication, to waiting to the next meeting, to leaving a message in Slack versus turning to the side and saying like, hey, Jen, can you help me with this? I'm struggling.
Well, I mean, to your point, that has to very deliberately be raised in one of our touch points. If it's not raised, then there can be no awareness, because you can't look over your shoulder and see, I think Jim's struggling right now, or I think Sally's struggling right now. You can't just see that or feel that, right? So like like Jim or Sally must actually elevate that concern in a meeting somewhere or during a touch point.
And that would be something else I wouldn't. So like practically what I would say is on the day that you are in the office, 1, actually let teams work together. 2, focus on the building of relationships. I don't care, have a D&D party, play a game of kickball, whatever it is. Go out to lunch together. Think about your high level strategy and vision, the big picture stuff. Have people talking about that and interacting, and have like the meeting where a leader of your company presents that. Don't do boring, like, how does this work break down? That's easy over Zoom. That's trivial. What do you do on those other days? What do you encourage people to do on those other days? You actually want to encourage a culture of raising issues, even more so than you did before. And healthy cultures are already encouraging people to like, hey, if you need help, ask for it, and those sorts of things. It's not natural for us. We were already having to push that. You have to push that more now, because people have more barriers to getting into that sort of synchronous communication, talking to their tech lead or whatever and saying like, hey, can you just like, I need an over the shoulder virtually as I'm trying to do something. Can you help me out? Because now it's not just like we're all working and we're here to work. When I do that, I feel like I'm interrupting your very life because I'm entering your house just in some virtual way. And I'm interfering with you. And it's like, no, we're still here. We're still working. We want to deliver value. And I think if you do those things, you're more likely to see success in the remote environment. Now, I say that without having that like validatable through some extensive study or anything. It's an argument from principle of what is or is not present around ideas of collaboration, learning, relationships, alignment in an in-person environment versus a remote environment. But I mean, that would be like my recommendation. That would be my advice.
When we talk about asynchronous versus synchronous, a thought that I had when that came up was, I think it's a belief that I have, a principled belief that I have, that the more uncertain the work is, like the more knowledge work is involved in what we're doing, the more necessary synchronicity is.
Mm-hmm.
So and I couldn't help but immediately note that the industries where this shift is most prevalent right now are in the knowledge work industries. So yeah, there's a dichotomy there, which is that software, for example, or research or whatever it is, like high tech kind of, blue collar, or wait, no, this would be white collar, right? White collar's the upper middle class one. See, that's how white collar I am. I don't even know the difference between white collar and blue collar anymore. So yeah. So like these white collar jobs are the ones where the work is most uncertain by nature, where value is a more fleeting concept, where it's like, okay, well, we got to figure out like who the customer is and what their demographic is and what they need and what they like and what the competition is doing. And then we need to like come up with ideas of things we can make. And then like, we're not going to be sure. We just have to keep trying stuff and find what sticks and, and develop products and R&D and like all this stuff. And these are the ones who have the most luxury of working from home right now. Like, again, like truck driver, mostly defined work, right? Like, you like, if you work at a meat packing plant, like you're going to work.
Yep.
You're going to work, and you have been going to work the whole time. Like, these people are, in many respects, not in the sense that like healthcare workers are and stuff, but frontline workers, if you will. They've kept the physical economy going while everyone has been trapped at home during the pandemic. So it's like, again, I find that really interesting that like our jobs require the most synchronicity. In fact, one of the reasons we built like open office plans came from knowledge work environments. They didn't come from defined work environments. You know what I mean? Like the old school defined thinking was like every person had their own
Office, yeah.
cubicle or office and was separated to focus on their own work, right? So like open office space is a child of the knowledge workspace, and yet we're now, I think, moving to a way more asynchronous world. And again, and on top of that, I think have convinced ourselves that that's totally fine or even preferable. And so, like, one thing I want to ask is like, were we wrong the whole time? Like, is all of this stuff, all of this evolution that's happened in the last 20 some odd
30,
years
yeah.
in the software space, is that all wrong? Because I feel like that's what we're saying without realizing it right now. Like, because like if we acknowledge the trade-offs, like you said, that's one thing. If we're like, hey, this is actually a lot less optimal, but we've got to do what we got to do. Diseases, pandemics, realities, or we can't afford our corporate office space anymore. Where there's realities that are pushing us in that direction. But then I would expect to see a lot more conversation about tools, techniques, methodology around like how do we stay aligned. To your point, like those suggestions that you just pitched out, for example, like I don't hear that many people talking about this. I feel like a lot of people are biding their time and cashing in on pre-existing alignment. So yeah, I worry that this is something doesn't add up here. You know what I mean? Like this doesn't feel as deliberate as I think we're making it out to be. Like, oh, we sold our corporate office space. This is the way of the future. All the pandemic really did was rush along something that was inevitable anyway. I hear this a lot.
Yeah.
Too, where it was like we all knew which direction things were going. I mean, you remember those guys, the guys we hired from Ireland that have been working remote for the last like 2 years. I mean, those guys are great, right? The Irish guys, the Irish team, yeah, they're awesome, right? Well, we're just all doing that now. And I'm just like, again, it's okay, right? Like really it is. Like no one meant for this to happen. No one wanted it to go like this. I'm not saying remote's bad, but like what worries me is the pretending that this was all deliberate, that this was all inevitable. And not, it makes me worry that we're not understanding the consequences of our decisions.
That's the one for me. Though the longer I work and maybe live, really, the longer I live, the more I look at the world and go like, there aren't trade-off free decisions. Sometimes they're really obvious because there's tons of pros and very few cons, but it's not, there's almost nothing. I can hardly think of a situation where there's just like, it's only positive.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. Like, let's say it first happens, and we're like, shoot, we're not trying to deal with this, but it's part of the pandemic, so let's adjust with it. It's not optimal. And then we realize, actually, there are some real benefits to having everybody remote, because there are. I'm not going to deny that. However, there are also some real trade-offs. There are some real consequences to having everybody remote. And by the way, we knew that because in the old world, we did have teams in Ireland or Hong Kong or Singapore or France or whatever. And one of the most common things you would hear from those remote people when you'd ask them how are things going is like, sometimes it's tough being remote. Oh, I feel disconnected.
You just reminded me of how much we took that for granted at HQ at Riot, actually. And then when you and I had the very privileged opportunity to travel around the world and meet people from other offices, there was a consistent piece of feedback, which is like, we generally feel disconnected from the nucleus, disconnected from the source.
Yeah.
Like we don't understand the direction and not the vision at the highest level. We all get that. And thank God Riot did that in spades,
They
because
did
that
that really
probably was the thing that saved this and made this work so well, or as well as it did. But
Yeah.
like there was this, like, we literally have no idea like what's on the agenda or like what the intentions are of anybody back at the home office. Like we rarely hear from them, and we pretty much just fend for ourselves.
When that
And that was their reality for a long, long time, right? Like it, presumably still is. So
And we would bring, I mean, even there were other times where like an office would be formed that was even people that were all on different teams, but they would all still go to that office
yeah,
and be present there together because there was value in the camaraderie. And so we knew this. We knew there were trade-offs to remote. Like you said, it's not like this just pushed forward some inevitable thing where
yeah,
we're all going to be sitting with VR goggles on someday and never leaving our beds. Like is that a potential future? Sure. It's a long way off. Like the pandemic didn't suddenly, shove us over the precipice or up the glorious mountain to that future. The reality is we knew there were trade-offs to remote work. We've always known it. If you asked anybody that worked remote, they could tell you. They could tell you of the struggle and the frustration of feeling disconnected, not sure what the team was doing, not sure what the company was doing, having to work twice as hard. I mean, I had one tech lead, great tech lead, works remote. He would step twice as fast and work 7 times as hard on relationships because he knew he was remote. And if he didn't, then he wouldn't be able to maintain the level of relationship he needed to do his job. And one of the things that happens when we focus so much on just, can I productively get work done, is we lose that underneath that, the purpose is to deliver value. And again, I'm going to walk through that thing. You need the relationship because the relationship is required for healthy collaboration. You need the healthy collaboration because the healthy collaboration is required for the shared learning. You need the shared learning because the shared learning is required to deliver the value. And you need to deliver the value because that's what your customers are going to ultimately pay you for. And that's what they're going to be satisfied by. And when we lose that arc, when we lose the value orientation in the knowledge workspace, and we focus instead on just like, did I have a bunch of time writing code or doing art today? Because that's what I'm supposed to do, right? And it's like, it misses the nuance of operating in a modern professional environment in a team. And I think actually one of the things, I think you drive people towards mercenary status. I think you drive groups away from being really well integrated teams and more into just working groups of people who independently do their own stuff. And also, I wonder about the question or the thing that you posed, which could be an outcome of being more mercenary and no longer connected to a team or the company as well. Are you actually as satisfied with your life? Are you as excited to be at that company? Are you as excited to go to work every day?
yeah. As I hear you talk about this, I'm, to put a bow around this from my perspective, I feel like there are two things present. There's something deeply professional here for me, and the way that I see work and the way that I see organizations at their best. And then there's something deeply personal here for me too. And actually, like one of the things, as we've talked a lot about this, I recognize my own bias,
Mm-hmm.
and my own need as a guy who's been trapped in his house for a lot of the last like 10 months, and how I miss people and how I can feel that inside, like how I can feel that I'm hungry to be with people, and I miss my teammates, and I miss, seeing people and reading their faces, and having that, the very tribalistic, for lack of a better term, like dynamic of just being in a group of humans, and like, wow, we're all here, we're all doing something. Like we were just talking earlier about like how that affects accountability, and how sometimes that accountability can feel good, when you don't want to let the team down, because like, we're in this together, and
We
like,
care about each other.
yeah, like there's something very human and very personal there for me that I feel like is lacking. And so I think I can feel that bias coming out as we talk about this. But there's another piece to this, which is like who I am as a professional and what I know, which is, and I think that the request I have from everyone and from myself is like, we've come a long way in the last 20 years. We've come a long way with how we think about teams, how we think about the role of the worker, the role of the manager, like how we organize ourselves, um, all of this stuff. And I don't want us to unintentionally throw a lot of the value of that away, uh, because we didn't stop to think, because we took for granted all of these wonderful things that we've had especially in our industry. Because I really do view, like, forget about financial privilege and white privilege and all this other stuff, like within the context of tech workers, but think about just the nature of the way we work and the way we get to work. You know what I mean? Like, we don't have to go and stamp manifolds in a hot factory all day and punch in at 8 and leave at 5. We get things like flexible working hours and unlimited PTO, and we get to, remote work, and, we get like the places, even when you're not remotely working, the places that these companies tend to be are amazing places. And then it's like high salaries. And it's just like we have all of these great things. And I don't want us to squander that and take that for granted either, because honestly, like, there's a lot of people out there that don't even have the benefit of being able to participate in this conversation. And then while I see us, frankly, when we're not at our best, wantonly kind of like kicking around these very valuable lessons that we've learned about the way the human mind works and the way that knowledge work works, over the last like 20 years. And so, like, I mean, it's hard enough to get people to embrace the agile mindset and get people to really understand how knowledge work functions and how collaboration works. And I think, again, from a professional point of view, I do sometimes feel like maybe we're slipping away from that, and that sucks. And again, I also want to cap this off by saying, like, I'm not like, oh, the world is falling, like we're going to be all remote and we're going to lose the human element. Like, I actually see a ton of positive in this. I think the reason I'm taking that side right now is because I legitimately feel like the deck is stacked on
Yeah.
the, like, remote work is awesome and everything's going to be better. And who cares about the old days where we used to work together in person? Pfft, that was like so antiquated. I can't believe we actually, like,
Yeah.
that's all I
There's
hear.
there's not a dialogue right now. There's
Yeah,
not.
that's all I hear. So I
Yeah.
mean, I there is a lot to be said about the power of, like, the interconnected, like, companies where people are working all with folks all across the globe, and the perspectives that bring in, the flexibility that brings in. I mean, like, if we could master that, I can very easily see a world where the benefits outweigh the costs. I just think we're very unaware of the benefits and the costs right now in a way that could be potentially damaging in the future. So
Completely agree. Yeah. I think that's a good wrap.
cool.